The topic today is the art of taking a positive message. Now listen up. Many of us discount a good message because we focus on the messenger instead of the message. How can we focus on taking a message despite not liking who possesses that message or even being able to relate to the person? Sometimes we see a message, but because it's from somebody that we do not agree with politically, we do not agree with religiously or any other means, we just discount it and we're like, no, I'm not going to listen to that. This video will show you, will teach you how you can focus on the message rather than the messenger. If we listen, sometimes we might be able to get things, we might be able to get information that will help to remove the mistakes of that person. I sat down today with a psychologist, someone who is very experienced in cognitive neuroscience. Ify is going to explain to us from her own professional standpoint what a good message is and the importance of taking a message no matter who the messenger is. This is the video. So guys, as I mentioned to you earlier, I had a conversation with a professional. I had a conversation with a psychologist, and her name is Ify. Hello, Ify. You're welcome to the channel. How are you doing today?
Hi, Baka. I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much once again for coming to have this conversation with us. We wanted to open up this topic about the art of taking a positive message. And when I looked through my network, I couldn't find any better person to help us to expand on this topic. So thank you very much for coming on the channel.
No problem.
Thanks. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Ify.
Okay, so a bit about myself. So my name is Ify, and I have a background in psychology. So I did my bachelor's degree in psychology, and then I did a master's in cognitive neuroscience, which is a branch of psychology that focuses on human behavior, but from a very neurological perspective. So what happens in our brain when we do certain things. And then I went on to do my PhD in psychology, which my main focus was around a concept called emotion regulation, which is basically how we process our emotions and how that is linked into mental health and well-being. So looking at emotion processing and concepts like stress, anxiety, and I was looking at that from a kind of lifespan perspective, so how that changes from when we are in our adolescent years, which is kind of the primary years of our emotional processing formation, down to when we are very old. And so that's my professional background in terms of academia, and I also have a qualification in CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and at the moment I'm working in the NHS with patients who have anxiety and depressive disorders. So that's a bit of my kind of academia or my academic and professional background.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. While we were about to get on, while we're having a chat, you did reveal to me that you had a PhD that you obtained at the age of 27. Can you tell us how easy it was to get that PhD?
So, I mean, I wouldn't say it was easy. I mean, as with everything in terms of academics and studying, it was a labor of love and it was difficult, but not the process per se of maybe getting the PhD. And I would say it wasn't difficult because I knew at the point when I was applying for my PhD, I knew that's what I wanted to do. But the process of the PhD was difficult because it's a very specialized type of study. You're researching something very specific for 3 to 4 years, or even, in my case, it took me about 4.5 years because of COVID. And you have to be very invested in what you're doing. But there's also the other side of things, which involves, as I mentioned, there's research. There are clinical components to it. You're working with patients, you're working with people, you're collecting data, and my PhD is quite cumbersome because I also included the kind of neurological side of things. So I've always been interested in the brain, and that's why I did a neuroscience master's. So I actually then collected data from my patients by taking MRI scans. So it was quite laborious in terms of the data collection, getting participants to take part, but also I was fortunate enough to get some funding, and I did part of my PhD in Nigeria. So I worked in schools, so secondary schools in Nigeria, and I collected some mental health data from the students in different secondary schools in Nigeria. I'm quite interested in the role that class also plays in mental health, so looking at disparities between children from what would call upper class or middle class, and then more kind of working class, and then the underclass or lower class in Nigeria, and then comparing their mental health data, their mental health experiences, and incorporating that into my PhD. So it was really time consuming, a lot of hours spent reading as well, and then leading up to the completion of the PhD, you have to do a huge piece of work which is called a thesis, and that could be up to anything between 30 to 70,000 words, and then ultimately that is followed on by a viva, which is an oral exam which lasts up to 3 hours, where you're essentially defending your thesis or what you've done over the last 3 to 4 years, and you're being questioned by 2 examiners. So the process itself is quite laborious. It's difficult, but it's enjoyable, because hopefully when you're choosing to do a PhD, you're choosing to do a PhD in a subject that you're passionate about, that you enjoy.
You like.
And so whilst obviously the difficulties that come with academia, with doing placements, with dealing with people if you have to do research or work with patients, but on the flip side, there is the enjoyment that comes from actually studying a topic very specifically over a period of years. So you get that enjoyment from doing something that you actually like during your PhD.
Part of my sarcasm there. Obviously, I meant exactly the opposite of what I meant there. What I was saying there, rather. Well done to you. That is awesome. That's an awesome thing. You obviously chase your dreams there. You focus on an area that you wanted to do, and in terms of academic, you've gotten to that level at a very young age. So well done for that.
Thank you.
Today we're here to talk about something that concerns people. On the channel here, Chat with the Tycoon, my interest really, I love a lot of things. I love football, I love mixed martial arts and boxing and the rest, and so many things that maybe I could have been talking about, but my interest is lifestyle. I want to see that people are able to change some of the things that they do. I want to see that human beings focus on important things, and that's why it's great to bring professionals like you on the channel to talk about things that concern human beings. So today, first of all, what is a good message in your opinion? Is it subjective? Is it something that is? What would you say is a good message?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, and I guess the first thing that I would like to say is, with regards to the question around what's a good message, is how long is a piece of thread? But ultimately, I think it's very subjective. I think thinking about a good message is really down to, I think, the person who is delivering the message and the person who is receiving the message. But there is a very, very subjective element as to how we would define a good message. But if we were to define it, say, maybe from a more general perspective, so by general I mean a perspective that majority of the population will accept as a definition of a good message, I would say that that would be a message that has a positive connotation. So positive meaning having a good meaning, or having a good outlook, basically. So having positive feelings or emotions attached to the message, so that ultimately when the person who's receiving the message gets the message, they have a positive outlook on their life, or that could improve how they feel, so they'll have positive feelings or positive emotions after receiving a good message. So that's how I would kind of define what a good message would be, if we were to take what the general population would kind of define it as. But I think ultimately it's quite subjective.
So then, does delivery matter then? I always tell people that I don't really care how you tell me something, but as long as you've told me the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. However, I understand that a lot of people would not listen to you if you're not delivering the right way. So does delivery matter in terms of the message, in your opinion?
Yes, definitely. I think how you deliver a message ultimately can make or break how that message is received. And even if the message you're delivering is not necessarily positive or good, I think the way you deliver it ultimately matters. Because if you think about us as human beings, I think perception is very key. So how we perceive things, very, very important. And that can obviously affect how we receive things as well. So I think ultimately when you're delivering a message, you think about the tone, so your tone of voice, how you're delivering the message. You think about how you're coming across as well. If it's, if you're delivering the message face to face, you're talking about body language, what are your eyes saying? What are your hands saying? And ultimately, I think, again, your tone is very much important. So I would definitely say what's as important as delivering a message is the way you deliver the message. So I think that is where I would stand in terms of delivery is important, because ultimately the way you deliver a message can change the outcome. Again, you could deliver a good message in a bad way, and the point of the good message will not be heard or will not be achieved, if that makes sense. So I think that definitely delivery is important.
Yeah, I'm taking your points. Delivery is important, and I agree with you. However, let me throw it this way, yeah. So does it mean then that generally, based on your experience, that people do not really care about what somebody is saying, whether it is a helpful information or not, but what they care about is how you're saying it? Like, how does that work? Because like I said again, for me, I think, growing up in the typical African environment, there's always, you wouldn't normally find that kind of what we call love or affection from not just parents, but like people around. Sometimes it's about, come on, go and do this, or, get up. Sometimes, there's this level of aggressiveness, right? And maybe that's why I'm thicker and I don't really care how someone tells me something. So the question here is, why does it matter so much how someone says something? Like, why do you think, apart from what you said that you deliver, like, why do you think it matters so much in terms of what does the brain, what is it about our brains or about people's brains that makes it necessary for you to say something in a good way? Is there anything maybe that is not normal for us? Is there anything, based on your experience, is there anything that you can tell us about this?
Yeah, so I think quite interestingly, as you mentioned, the brain. So there's a part of the brain which I think a lot of people might know, or if they don't know about it, it's the amygdala. And the amygdala is quite a primitive part of our brain, but is ultimately responsible for what we call the flight or fright response. So when there is perceived threat in the environment or danger, the amygdala goes into flight or fright mode, sorry. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because when you're delivering a message, that's why I mentioned tone. I think the way the human mind tends to work is if someone is coming to tell you something and they're coming in, say for example, they're coming in quite an aggressive, quite high-pitched quite a very confrontational sounding way, it doesn't matter if that message is positively. Ultimately, the amygdala, because of the way it is, and it's a part of our brain that hasn't really evolved in thousands of years because of the function of it, is the amygdala gets activated and we ultimately feel a sense of threat. We feel like we are being challenged, our safety is being challenged, or we are going to be confronted. And ultimately what the amygdala does is it kind of creates that response, and we ultimately get very, very, we can get anxious, we can get very threatened. And so that's why I mentioned that delivery is very important, because you can come to deliver a good message, but ultimately if the way you're coming, if the brain senses that there is threats, it will do what it's meant to do in terms of keeping you safe, and you will ultimately feel very flared up, or you can feel very threatened or very anxious, and therefore that good message may not necessarily be taken in a good way. So that's why I think it's important, and that's why I said delivery is quite important, because ultimately if we feel threatened or triggered, our amygdalas are just going to be activated and we'll feel quite stressed, and that can obviously lead to a response that's not necessarily matching the situation. If someone's coming to tell you a good message but they're coming in a way that you feel quite threatened, you might not receive that good message in a positive way.
That's very interesting. So then what is the importance of relevance? So relevance, let's say a situation where, for instance, someone is, you're walking on a street, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a vehicle is coming at speed, and someone else is shouting at you, like screaming. At that point, someone is screaming, right? But because it's a situation of life and death, you quickly get that message and you get off.
Yes.
So what's the importance of relevance compared to, in this situation? I don't know if that question makes sense. What is the importance of relevance?
Yeah, so again, let me just make sure I'm understanding what you're asking me. So you're asking what's the importance of the relevance of maybe feeling threatened. So the example you gave is you're on the road, you're about to cross the road, and someone shouts at you, and ultimately they're passing a message, and then you respond, and then maybe someone's coming to tell you something, and regardless of if it's a positive or a negative message, and again we tend to obviously respond. So are you asking, is it the relevance of maybe the function of the amygdala, or is it the relevance of the message? Just want to make sure that I understand.
The relevance of the message. The relevance of the message here.
Yeah, so I guess the relevance of the message is quite important, but like I mentioned, is I think going back to the point, the amygdala is quite a primitive part of the brain, so it hasn't necessarily developed or advanced like other parts of the brain. So ultimately is once we feel threatened, and as I mentioned, threat could be someone shouting at you to, car's about to hit you, or someone is shouting at you and telling you a message. Ultimately the amygdala will sense there is some type of threat. And I think the other thing to mention as well is human beings are very different. So people have different levels of sensitivity in terms of how they are sensitive as individuals. But I think also as well, people have had previous experiences, and we develop schemas from previous experiences. So a schema is an idea, an ideology of the world that is built based on your previous experience. Now, if you have previously experienced a situation where, messages, and again, regardless of it, because you can praise somebody or give somebody a positive message in a way that doesn't necessarily sound positive. So if people have schemas where, although they've received some positive messages in the past, but the delivery has almost seemed quite contradictory. So you're telling me I've done well, but again, that's why I mentioned around tone of voice and body language. You're telling me I've done well, but your eyes are telling me otherwise. The tone of your voice is telling me otherwise. People develop these schemas, and ultimately they feel threatened. So again, because the amygdala isn't as developed as other parts of the brain, there will still be an ultimate sense of threat. So it will still feel quite similar to when you're crossing the road and someone's yelling at you to stop because that car's going to hit you. it will almost be the same feeling if somebody's delivering a message, but they're doing so in a way that still makes you feel threatened. And ultimately,
Right.
you can't really control what your brain does. So your amygdala will ultimately get activated to some extent. And again, as I mentioned, linking back to schemas, if you have developed a schema where you have the idea that, messages being passed, regardless of if it's positive or negative, the delivery hasn't necessarily matched the content of the message, then ultimately you might feel some sense of threat when you're receiving those messages.
Interesting. Very, very interesting perspective there. So then, in terms of the receiver now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So does the receiver of a message need wisdom or discernment in order to take a good message, or does it not matter whether they need any wisdom or not? Are you just going to take something because someone says it?
Oh no, definitely. There is an element of, so I think there is an element of discernment. There's also an element of choice. And maybe even more importantly is also an element of who's delivering the message. So those three things play a role in how the message is received. I think when someone tells you something, you ultimately think about the content of what's being told. So if someone's passing on a positive message, you obviously take the content of the positive message. But now there is maybe an additional layer to that, is how, what's the message in the first place? And I think thinking about positive messages as well, I think maybe the other thing to think about could be sometimes positive messages might not necessarily, so let me use an example. So somebody can come, a positive message could be, you got the job. And a positive message could also be, don't take this job because the workplace is toxic. Yeah. Does that make sense? So ultimately, both messages could be viewed as positive. And that's where discernment then comes in, is you have to discern, is this message, what is this message? What's the relevance of this message to my situation? Why is this person even telling me this in the first place? And that's where the element of, again, thinking about who the messenger is. Again, is it somebody that has had the best intentions for me by previously giving me advice that's been relevant or useful? Or is this somebody that's just coming because they feel, and again, I think maybe thinking about being African, being Nigerian, how many times have people come to give us their 2 cents about our lives? People that we don't even necessarily know. Maybe an auntie that saw you when you were born and she hasn't seen you for the last 20 something years, but then she's ultimately coming to tell you, an uncle coming to tell you how you should live your life, or coming to give you a positive message as to how you proceed with work, with your marriage, with family. And you're just like, but I don't really know you. So I think that's where discernment comes into play. And then there's the additional element of who's delivering the message. So it'll be quite difficult for, say, for example, somebody who has never achieved a particular thing coming to tell you now how to achieve that thing. So say, for example, somebody who has never worked in their entire life coming to tell you how to apply for a job. Now that's a positive, you're looking for a job. Ultimately, someone is coming to tell you, I can help you get a job. But then you look at the person and it's like, ultimately, you've never had a job, or you've never been able to hold down a job. So who are you to come and tell me how to, get a job or be able to keep a job? So there are different components to it. There's the element of discernment, is thinking about the message, the content of the message. How relevant is this message to you, to the stage of your life you're in? But also, who is the messenger? Is this person, or does this person have, so if we wanted to be very scientific, can we quantify things in this person's life that they've done to warrant or give them the authority to pass on this message to us? So I think that is an additional element to kind of receiving the message.
Yeah, I like your last point there about whether someone has done something before they're able to advise. That brings me to the next question, which is, do you have to respect someone in order to listen to them, or do you just listen to anyone?
I mean, to be honest, we're more likely to receive messages from people with respect. I think that's just a natural human behavior. The way our brains are tailored is, the more respect you have for someone, ultimately, the more highly you're going to perceive them. So thinking about social perspective, you respect someone, it means that their points or their opinions are relevant compared to someone who you don't respect, sorry. You're obviously not going to take them as seriously, and that's just natural human behavior. So I think there is a huge element of respect in the person, and I think this goes down to who the messenger is. So is this somebody that you respect? Is this somebody that's in a position to give you advice because they have achieved something in life, or they hold certain qualifications or certain position in the community or in your family to then come and tell you something? So I think ultimately there is that element. But I think with respect as well, respect can be earned. So you can ultimately respect someone after they've given you a message. And the reason why I say that is because of how the message is delivered. So it could be someone who's a stranger or someone who you're not too familiar with. So you haven't really established a social bond with that person to the point where you're like, this person, I highly respect them because, you know, of XYZ. But ultimately, it could be someone who comes and delivers a message, but you look at the manner of delivery. And this is why, going back to our initial point around body language and tone is so important. If someone comes to you and they're very calm, they have a very good demeanor at how they're passing on the message, you can ultimately develop respect from the way this person has passed on their message, and ultimately you're more likely to take on the message from that person. Because again, I think with respect is quickly earned and can quickly be lost. So this, you know, the process of losing respect and gaining respect is quite similar. You can quickly lose respect for someone and you can quickly gain respect from someone. And ultimately, the element of respect can come in after the message has been delivered. So again, it's the manner in which the message was delivered. If you feel like the person was quite mature about it, was quite well spoken about it, and again, you think about when the message has been delivered. If this is someone, like I said, it might not be someone that's in your social circle or someone you have a social bond with, but ultimately, if this person has come to you with respect, again, respecting you in terms of how they pass on the message, could also be respecting your kind of social space as well. I think that's the other element is, again, thinking, growing up in a Nigerian African household, there is this thing where like they just come, like, you know, the aunties, the uncles, the mom and dads, they come straight right in front of your face and they're literally speaking to you eyeball to eyeball. And ultimately, again, if someone comes to you and they're mindful of your personal space and they're mindful of, you know, the environment, things around you, you can get respect after a message has been passed.
Very. I mean, I can totally relate with that. Normally, I think it's and that's why people have mentors, right? That's why people have people that they watch regularly, or they follow, or they listen to, and that's really, really, really important. Respect. I agree with you on that one, 100%. And then moving on now. So what is more important? Is it the messenger or the message, or are these two things at the same level in terms of? I think you can link this to my question earlier about relevance. You know, So what is more important? Is it messenger or the message? Because normally there's a word out there: don't do what I do, but do what I say. Or forget about the messenger, take the message. So you know what's important.
The saying just came to my head is, don't shoot me, I'm just a messenger. People say that a lot before they say something. And I think that is a very interesting question. The reason why I say it's an interesting question is because I think it's very much down to perspective. And this is where, as human beings, it's very interesting that we have our own different perspectives, because the question you've asked me now, if you ask somebody else, they might ultimately say that, oh my God, I feel like one is more important than the other, or both are equally as important. But I think from maybe taking a more neutral standing, I would say both are quite as important. The message can be equally as important as the messenger. And I think it's also very circumstantial, because if the messenger, again, linking back to my point that I touched upon around who is delivering the message. So if someone who is delivering the message doesn't have substance to themselves, so they cannot show or prove, again, if we really want to be scientific, they cannot show or prove that especially if the message that they're delivering, they haven't necessarily achieved or can relate to that message. It will be very difficult for someone who, like I mentioned with the example of someone who is coming to tell you how to get a job, if they've never worked or they've never been able to hold down a job. So ultimately, in that case, if the message doesn't fit the messenger, sometimes we can have alarm bells going off in our head, and we can feel sometimes can feel very triggered, regardless of the content of the message, even if it's a good message. And that's where that feeling of who are you to tell me what to do then comes in, because we're ultimately, you can separate the message from the messenger, and sometimes you focus more on the messenger because it's like, you haven't achieved this, so why are you telling me how to do this? You don't have anything to show for the message that you're trying to pass on to me, so what makes you qualified enough to then come and tell me this good message, quote unquote? And so I think both can be equally important. Sometimes, again, depending on the situation, you can go from the message to the messenger, so you'll be bouncing back from one to the other.
Yeah, and by the way, this, I can relate this totally to politics, right? Oftentimes we see politicians who have held positions in the past come back to give out, and they didn't really do much when they were in the position, out to say things about what is going on. Like, dude, you were literally just there, and we didn't really feel. So it's it's a very tricky, very tricky thing, and that's why it's always good for people to keep a good image, right? That's why image is important, because if you have a good image out there, people are more likely to listen to you overall than when you have a negative one.
That's really important, actually, that you brought up around having good image. So how you're perceived by people is very important. And just maybe going slightly off tangent is around, you see there are a lot of people of questionable character that have amassed a huge following, and they pass on messages or ideologies that are very questionable in terms of what moral grounds the message is coming from. There's even issues around ethics, but you find people clinging on to those immoral, unethical values because it's coming from a messenger that is being perceived to be very important. So I think ultimately, just to kind of add on to what you're saying, I think the image of the messenger is also very important, because you can ultimately pass on negative messages and have people cling on to that and buy into that ideology, even if your image is not necessarily a positive image.
Very true, very true. And this kind of thing has unfortunately even led a lot of people to very difficult situations, to get into trouble, get arrested, or even sometimes they're untimely dead because they believed someone who was basically leading them down the wrong path. That's very important. Right. So I mean, so what emotional state then is the best in order to receive a message? What's the best situation or position mentally that the average human being should be in order to receive a message? Is there any best way to get a message?
I mean, I guess ultimately is if we're thinking on the topic of a good message, it would be, again, thinking about the content of the message. You would want the content of the message to often match your mental state. So a good message would be hopefully positive emotional state. But I think it doesn't necessarily matter, because the other thing to think about as well is, if you're going to deliver a good message, ultimately someone isn't necessarily in a positive state of mind, that good message could quickly boost their emotions. So for example, if someone's feeling quite upset, feeling quite low, maybe even feeling depressed, and you come and you say to them, you know what, okay, I can help you get a job, or I can help you sort out XYZ. Ultimately, that message is going to have an impact on the person's mood, definitely. Even if it's not going to take them, if we were to rate their emotions on a scale of 0 to 10 and say their mood was around a 3 being quite low mood, and then you come and pass on a good message, ultimately that can take their mood up to a 6 or a 7. So that would be some improvement in their feelings, in their emotions. But I think the emotional state doesn't necessarily matter. And the reason why I say this as well is because oftentimes we can't control our emotional states, especially if you're the one delivering a message. You don't necessarily know the state of mind that somebody is in. You can anticipate, for example, you can maybe ask someone, and people often do this before they pass on a message, is now a good time to talk? How are you feeling? I'm about to tell you something. When is a good time for me to pass on this message? And that's ultimately done to kind of have a sense of where the person is emotionally, because the last thing you want to do, at least as a decent human being, would be to deliver a message when someone is not feeling their best, because what you don't want to do as well is, you don't know people's emotional thresholds. You could push someone to the other side, and by the other side I mean they can go from feeling bad to feeling worse, and that could obviously have emotional consequences in terms of someone might just end up becoming quite severely depressed on top of that. So I think the emotional state's important, but it's how do we mitigate the emotional state? How do we exactly know for 100% how someone's feeling just before we pass on a message? Even if they vocalize to us verbally and they say I'm happy, again, sometimes what we say doesn't match how we're feeling internally, because again, not to go too deeply into the context of emotions, but having studied emotions for quite a number of years, I know that how we feel mentally and sometimes what we're reporting doesn't often match. I see this a lot with my patients, where when they complete some of their clinical questionnaires about their mood, they often report to be feeling either quite happy or quite sadder than they are, and that is either way. So I think in terms of how we feel mentally and internally and how we are reporting, so our subjective reports of our emotions can be quite different. And I think ultimately, whilst the emotional state is important, is really, you can't really for 100% know how somebody's feeling when you're about to deliver a message.
Ultimately I think what I get from that is that it depends on someone's mental capacity, right?
Exactly.
So thanks Ify for coming on the channel today. Just
No
before
problem.
we wrap up, is there something else that you want to talk about? You want to just push out there? Do you want to say something to the people listening, or to the audience?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me on your show, because I really appreciate it. And I think just to kind of sum things up is, I think ultimately is, firstly, as a mental health professional, I always say to people, look after yourself, and that's looking after yourself mentally and emotionally. But I think as well is, when it comes to receiving messages, I think there is an element of what we would call in psychology, we call it the reasonable mind. And what that encompasses is it's a combination of your emotional mind, which is emotional reasoning, and your logical mind. So ultimately, just to say that when we receive messages, and even when we're passing on messages to people, regardless of if it's a positive, good message or a more negative message, is ultimately to try and do things when you're in your reasonable mind. So not letting emotions 100% be the reason or be the main driver or the driving force when you're passing on messages, and trying to be in that kind of reasonable mind where you are thinking, so with your emotional mind, I'm thinking, how is the message I'm going to pass across going to make someone feel? And also being logical is also considering, okay, what's the relevance of me passing on this message, and trying to do things in a more reasonable mind state. So trying to have some type of balance, and just ultimately, for everyone to stay well and try to just look after themselves, especially as we approach the winter months, because we are approaching what we would call the seasonal affective disorders month, whereas people feeling quite depressed, feeling quite low. So the next couple of months are going to be quite difficult. So people just trying to look after themselves. Take some, I would highly recommend vitamin D. It's very good to boost your mood, magnesium as well, and trying to do exercise and keeping active will help throughout the winter months, as we have shorter days and longer nights. So that's my kind of 2 cents in advice to people on the show.
That's very positive message, and I'm sure that the audience, thanks everyone for watching. I'm sure this message has boosted your mood and has encouraged you as we come into the winter. I'm sure you will be happy to share your socials with us, and we'll put it in the description below. And if there's, I don't know, if is there any projects that you have coming on, is there anything that you want people to come on? Would you want to use this medium to maybe let people know what you do? And if they have any issues, I'm sure, you're giving general encouragement, but personally now, and it's fine if you don't want to, would you want to maybe encourage people to come on and maybe see you, maybe visit you for some help, right? So would you be willing to talk to the people about what you do?
Yes, so not a problem. And yes, I would recommend there should be no shame in mental health. I think just the way we look after ourselves in terms of we fuel our body with food, some people do exercise, try and look after their physical bodies. I think our mental and emotional state of mind is very important. And to say that, there is no shame in having mental health issues, and I think especially in the African and Nigerian community there is a lot more work we can do in terms of normalizing mental health. So if you're feeling sad, it's okay to feel sad and it's okay to seek help. And there are so many at least here in the UK, there are so many services available. So for example, Talking Therapies is a service that's available to provide support if you are experiencing mild to moderate depression, anxiety disorders, but there are also other services. The Samaritans are quite good as well for if you're in emotional or psychological distress. But again, thinking like my main modality in terms of treatment modality is CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's quite useful in terms of managing anxiety and depressive disorders. But again, if anyone is looking to reach out to me, I'm happy to share my socials. If even if you don't need mental health help, it could just you want to have a chat about mental health or know more about CBT or psychology, or you might be interested in going into the field of psychology and you're unsure how to, I'm more than happy to have a discussion and a chat about that. But also looking at people who want to do more work abroad, so in Nigeria, African countries, to improve mental health again. That's something I'm really passionate about. So if you have any kind of interest around working internationally with the local communities to speak about mental health, create mental health awareness, provide mental health support to children, young adults, and people generally in places like Nigeria, Ghana, then also feel free to reach out to me, because that's also something that I'm interested in working on sort of in the next couple of years.
Great. Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you for coming on, and hopefully we'll see you again.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Thank you very much for watching the video. Thanks for being on the channel. Please kindly subscribe. Click here to subscribe. Please leave a message. Please share the video. Please comment. Please like, so that the algorithm lords can help us. Thank you very much, and God bless you. See you on the next one.